All right, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Central Asia program at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. My name is Sébastien Pérouse, and I'm the director of the Central Asia program. Thank you very much for joining us today. We're really happy to have this important panel discussion on the legacy of corruption, Karim Massimov, and the Nazarbayev system. Today's event addresses a deeply consequential topic, not only for Kazakhstan, but for all who are concerned with the global fight against corruption and kleptocracy. And as many of you know, in January 2022, Kazakhstan was shaken by a wave of protests that began over fuel prices, but which quickly evolved into a broader expression of public anger, which was actually rooted in years of inequality, of repression, and of institutionalized corruption. And the tragic outcome of these events, with more than 220 lives lost, left a very serious mark on the country. And just over a year later, former Prime Minister and National Security Committee head Karim Massimov was convicted of treason, a development that has raised serious questions about internal power struggles and accountability within the legacy of President Nursultan Nazarbayev's regime. And while Massimov may be one of the most prominent figures to face justice, he is also emblematic of a much deeper and systemic problem. So today we'll be discussing a new report published by Freedom for Eurasia titled Napoleon Complex, which offers very detailed insights into Massimov's accumulation of vast personal wealth and his central role in sustaining the kleptocratic network surrounding the Nazarbayev system. So this report really helps us understand why confronting corruption is so essential for genuine reform and democratic progress. So we have our three very distinguished speakers today, Ms. Leila Nazgul Seidbek, Mr. Thomas Main, and Dr. David Zacconi, who will present the report's findings and reflect on the broader implications for Kazakhstan political future and for global anti-corruption efforts. So each our panelists will present, I guess, about 15 minutes, and after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. So please feel free to send your questions in the chat box. And with that, so let me introduce our first panelist, who is going to be, I guess that's going to be Leila, right, Leila?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll be glad to start.
Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah. So Leila is an exiled lawyer and human rights advocate from the Kyrgyz Republic. She's a chairwoman of Freedom for Eurasia, which documents and reports on human rights, kleptocracy, and corruption abuses in the former Soviet Republic of Eastern Europe and Central Asia. So Leila, thank you for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you everyone for joining us today to discuss our report and the findings in the report, and also the broader issue of kleptocracy and the situation in Central Asia. Well, I guess I'll start with kind of explaining of what we were trying to do while creating this report. We were trying to show in the most simple language, in the most understandable way, to show what a kleptocracy is and how it functions, and basically explaining the mechanics of that system, and have it sort of like serve as an anatomical encyclopedia that lays out the nature of corruption and the people that participate in that system, how everything works. And there is a very detailed also explanation of why this system is very similar to a mafia organization. And it also explains that the people that benefit from this system are the people that are standing at the top of political systems, structures. And we used a real-life example of a very important politician, Kazakhstan, Massimov, and he provided us with very rich foundation from which we were able to use some of the examples. Unfortunately, we were not able to use all of them because there were just way too many of them, but we used the most grotesque ones, I guess, to show the way of life of a kleptocrat and how that kleptocrat uses a state system for his own personal needs, and how he uses state servants as members of his own household, as butlers, as chauffeurs, as tourist agents. It was really amazing, actually, to see something like this. And even for Tom and I, who are very familiar with these countries, that was quite shocking. One of the shocking examples that we provide in the report, for example, is the description of his spending. For example, he paid $200,000 for an astrological reading to a Russian astrologer. And that raised so many questions that when we saw a SWIFT document confirming that payment, that raised questions like, whether or not the astrologist has actually warned Massimov about the upcoming arrest, or whether, and to what extent did Massimov actually rely on prognosis like this in making state and policy decisions. So when you think about the highest, the person that is occupying one of the highest positions in the government in a country like Kazakhstan, it's a big country to run, and you see, superstition and also other grotesque things that he has done, that really, raises questions on how well a kleptocrat can really run a country. And we also show how a kleptocrat has turned the agency that he had into an ATM machine, and turned the diplomatic service into his personal assistants, who were running around the world, sourcing ancient books for him and letters from historical persons, and arranging to smuggle all of those antiquities for him, avoiding the customs inspections. And it's just so shameful that something like that has been happening, while at the same time, we know what was happening to the people in Kazakhstan at that time. The people were dying in the protests. They were dying because they were trying to find justice. They were completely unable to find any justice within the system. They suffer because they have no access to clean water. In some parts of Kazakhstan, there are no roads. They have no access to education. They have no access to medical help. It's the situation for average Kazakh citizens is quite bad. And at the same time, when you see people like Massimov buying a puppy for his daughter for $3,000 and making a donation to a US school or to a French school in an amount of $200,000, $250,000. So it's really mind-boggling. it's also important to note that all of those issues in countries like Kazakhstan and in the other countries of Central Asia, the issues like poverty and human rights abuses are consequences of corruption. They're consequences of kleptocracy, and solving these issues will require first to address the issue of corruption and kleptocracy. They will not be solved without first addressing that issue, because a kleptocrat will never honestly try to solve these issues and ensure that his citizens have access to freedoms, have access to rights, because things like freedom of speech, things like freedom of assembly, they in themselves threaten the very structure of a kleptocracy, and they cannot allow that, because that will make their work of enriching themselves very difficult, and that's really not something they naturally will do. It's I think it's important to also remember that we need to take action about kleptocrats sooner than later, because the longer we allow them to thrive, the more powerful they become. They become richer, they are able to hire armies of the best lawyers. They hire best accountants, best PR consultants, best lobbyists. And we do already have examples where actually Kazakh oligarchs have become so powerful that when a law enforcement agency in the UK was trying to investigate them, they have attacked them with a lawfare, and the law enforcement agency was unable to actually do anything about them. The case collapsed, and it's quite understandable why they were not able to compete with that. Is because these Kazakh oligarchs have spent close to $500 million on their lawfare against law enforcement, against the officers that were investigating them, against the journalists that were writing about them. It's really difficult to fight with them when we allow them to become that powerful. What I also wanted to point out is during the research and writing of this report, we also realized that with the time, because of impunity, the kleptocrats become very sloppy. And when we were studying their documents, we have actually found out that they've been recycling their offshore companies. We saw offshore companies that they've been using, that they used previously already, that have been mentioned in the other investigations in the past. And what they also did, they have been so careless that they would be, copy pasting texts of fake contracts and fake memorandums about transfer of tens of millions of dollars. They've been pasting them off of the previous documents, and we would see documents, legal documents, that they were submitting to probably banks and some other agencies, where the letterhead would be talking about one company, and that the body of the text will contain the name of a totally different company. And that is happening because they really know that there is nothing, they will face no consequences. They really were not worried. And the amounts that they have been transferring between their offshore companies are quite shocking. They're not 1 or 2 million. They're like in hundreds of millions. It also raises a question of how these sums were going through the financial systems without raising any questions. We have also found interesting transactions where companies of Nazarbayev's daughters were used. And we believe that these transactions were also bribes because they were based off of false contract that was never meant to be carried out. I think Nazarbayev Aliya was supposedly selling sugar or something that was never delivered. And the amount was not small either. It was close to $25 million. So I guess what I want to also say in conclusion is that it's really important for the democratic countries to finally show the kleptocrats that they are a force to be reckoned with, that they're not going to look away, that they will take measures against the kleptocrats and against the dirty money that they're bringing to the West, that they will not allow their jurisdictions to be used and their politicians to be influenced by the dirty money. And it would be better if it would be good if these actions are taken sooner than later. I also want to say that although we have temporarily, I think, lost the U.S. as in our fight against corruption with disbanding of the kleptocracy task forces, there are still things happening, and there are countries that are stepping up. There was some news that we have read in the recent days about anti-corruption task force that was created by UK, France, and Switzerland. And we really hope that the task force will be successful. We really also hope that this task force will make sure that they work in close cooperation with the civil society organizations and the experts in order to use their expertise to strengthen the cases that they're investigating. I think it's very important to get the experts engaged simply because they can provide the context of the issue, and I think it's very important to reinforce the cases this way. There are also things happening in the US. I mean, there are people also in the legislative branch that still believe that fight against corruption is important. We have noticed that there was a bill submitted to the Congress that's called Combating Global Corruption 2025. And it basically calls to lay out a framework to start rating the countries according to their implementation of the anti-corruption measures. And it also sort of lays out the framework to implement the norms of the Convention Against Corruption. So these are good things that we've seen so far. And yeah, we really hope. I really encourage everyone to read the report, and I would be glad if you send us questions. We are here to answer them. We are glad to discuss any aspects you would like connected to the report. Yeah, that's pretty much all. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Leila. Let's go now to our second speaker, who is going to be Mr. Thomas Main, who is a research professor at University of Exeter and a former visiting fellow at Chatham House, a Royal Institute of International Affairs. Prior to this, Thomas worked as a senior campaigner at anti-corruption NGO Global Witness, where he was responsible for the group's reports on Central Asia and Eurasia. His current research project builds on his expertise in analyzing kleptocratic flows by looking at networks of professional service providers that enable illicit flows from corruption hotspots. Tom, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Sebastian, and thanks to Leila for setting the scene there. Now, I've worked on many reports over the years, and perhaps this is my favorite. Perhaps it's wrong to have a favorite when you're talking about corruption, but it's one of my favorites because of the wealth of documentary evidence we have here, which allows us, as Layla said, to kind of peek behind the curtain of kleptocracy and see how it operates from on a day-to-day basis. I'm sure there are many experts listening, but if you're new to the game, what is kleptocracy? Well, kleptocracy is a systemic grand corruption where a country is basically run for the benefit of a few individuals, the individuals who are in power. Use a quote from a book here. It's my book. I'll promise I won't plug it too much during the next hour. But what I want to stress in this talk is the global nature of kleptocracy and how perhaps we shouldn't really talk about Kazakh kleptocracy, but Kazakh UK or Kazakh Swiss kleptocracy, because what happens in a kleptocracy is assets are moved from the country, such as Kazakhstan, from the place where there isn't rule of law and there isn't necessarily stability, into a place of stability, such as the UK. It's the transnational aspect of kleptocracy, which is very important, that this is wealth going across borders and it's facilitated by a host of enablers and network companies that allow it to happen. In Kazakhstan, we have so many examples, and there's no time to go through them all, but basically any money-making enterprise in Kazakhstan under President Nazarbayev had links to him. Kazakhmys, a FTSE 100 company here in the UK for a time, had as a director Nazarbayev's best friend, former Chief of Staff Vladimir Ny. Oil and gas, you could write a book about corruption in Kazakhstan related to the oil and gas sphere. How about we mention the original Kazakhgate scandal, where President Nazarbayev was shown to have a secret Swiss bank account into which flowed tens of millions of dollars related to the country's oil wealth. But today, we are talking about Massimov, and we're talking about telecoms. Again, if you're not a Kazakh expert, Massimov wasn't some kind of junior minister with his hand caught in the expenses jar. We're talking about perhaps the most important political figure in Kazakhstan's independent history after Nazarbayev, who held the most senior positions in the country. And the link to telecoms, we've actually been investigating for quite a few years at Freedom for Eurasia. We produced a report in 2023 called Bad Connection, which really started to talk about the problem with Kazakh Telecom, which is, on the face of it, really a state-controlled company. If you look at the top right-hand corner there, 51% is held, or was certainly in 2006, 2007, by Samruk, which is the Kazakh state holding company. But often in kleptocracies, you have these shares which are privately held. And what I want to stress is that in a kleptocracy, the dividing line between public and private, between state and personal, basically gets obliterated. And in this example, we have 16.9% of the company held by a Dutch company called Bodam BV. It's a private company holding shares in a state company. And as we said at the time, it wasn't revealed by Kazakh Telecom who stood behind Bodam BV. And we said that any person, including Kazakh officials, could have been the owner of this company and therefore receive benefit from Kazakh Telecom. We're now a few years into our research, and as the new report, Napoleon Complex, indicates, actually reveals via research done by the BBC here in the UK, that Massimov himself, for a short time, was a shareholder in Bodam BV, and therefore a shareholder in Kazakh Telecom in 2006 and 2007. This is clearly a conflict of interest, a massive conflict of interest for a state official to be involved in a private company which is receiving benefit from state work. This is very likely illegal under Kazakh law, which says that Kazakh officials should not be involved in any business outside of limited academic work. We fast forward a year or two, Massimov seems to have removed himself from the ownership of Bodam BV, and the shareholder of Bodam BV is then revealed to be, the shareholder on paper at least, a woman called Aygur Nuriyeva. Now, she, to my mind, is absolutely a classic proxy. So even though it's her name on the shares, it is really, she's only holding those shares for the benefit of more senior figures, such as Massimov. Now, you might say, well, you know, and when we write these reports, you're always playing devil's advocate. You're always saying, you know, well, is there another explanation? Perhaps Massimov realized the conflict of interest and stepped away. And despite his friendship with Nuriyeva, they worked together at Halleck Bank there in 1998. Perhaps, you know, she was running it completely separate as a private enterprise without any input from Massimov. Now, if you're from Kazakhstan, you probably have a smile on your face and thinking that that's you know, is ridiculous. But let's kind of explore that. It just doesn't seem plausible on the face of it, because if you look at Nuriyeva's history, she seems to have come out of nowhere to all of a sudden become one of the richest people in the country with a fortune of $720 million. How did that happen? She doesn't seem to have any particular expertise, what we know from her biography, in telecoms. She was a fund manager in 2008, and then all of a sudden she is stated to own this massive fortune. How did she acquire the capital to buy the shares in the first place of Kazakh Telecom? If she got a loan, if it was leveraged, why particularly was it she who was chosen? Now, of course, you might say, well, okay, it might look suspicious, but, you know, come on, Freedom from Eurasia, come on, Tom. We need a little bit more than just speculation. Well, we have a particular deal I want to take you through. It's quite complex, but I think it's worth spending a few minutes on it. And what is great in the report is that we've provided virtually all of the documents in the reference section, so you can click on an individual reference and see the file that I'm referring to in these next slides. So Bodam, which as we know is the shareholder in Kazakh Telecom, is proposing to sell some of its shares. Okay, let's think of it always as a legitimate transaction. There doesn't seem to be you know, anything wrong with that. We have a letter on the right hand. The yellow is my highlighting. It says letterhead of proposed purchaser. So they perhaps a little bit strange that they don't know who's buying the shares yet, but maybe there's a few different parties who are interested in acquiring these shares. Two companies step up, registered in the British Virgin Islands, of course, Sherfield Limited and Malgray, and they're owned by a Kazakh bank, Exim Bank, which is owned in turn by three individuals, most notably Alexander Klebanov. Okay, so this looks like that Nuriyeva is selling her shares to a Kazakh bank. Perhaps, is it strange that a Kazakh bank would own shares in a telecoms company? Not sure, but let's just, you know, maybe there's, you know, a good explanation for it. You know, let's continue. Step 3, we see the agreement between these two companies and Bodam develop, and the red is text added by Nuriyeva or another person. They say that there should be a security deposit paid by Malgray and Sherfield. Again, perhaps nothing unusual in that. You want to know that the person you're dealing with has the money to hand. The shares are costing a lot of money, 25 million. Two companies, bit strange that two companies owned by the same bank. That, you know, why not do it in one company? But, you know, maybe there's reason for that too. 25 million, it looks like the shares are going to be sold for, and the security deposit has been put down. And indeed, we see Nuriyeva being the one who's driving this forward with changes made to the agreement. We see the money transferred. So 25 million is transferred in 2007 in several tranches to Bodam's account, which is in the Netherlands. So great, it looks like these two companies in the BVI are going to become the new shareholders of Kazakh Telecom via Bodam. It's Bodam selling the shares. However, that's not what happens. Sherfield and Malgray, the proposed buyers, say that they've not been able to get the permits from the Kazakh government. And not only that, that Bodam can keep the money. And this is despite the fact that all the money at that time had not even been transferred. and the deadline for the deal was 6 months away. Now, this obviously makes completely no sense from a business point of view. If you are Exim Bank and you are buying shares, why would you give up $25 million so easily without disputing why you've not been able to get the permits from the Kazakh government? It just makes no sense. This looks very much like a bribe. And seeing that at the time, according to the BBC, Massimov was standing behind Bodam, looks very much like a bribe to Massimov. We have the money going out of Kazakhstan. We have that transnational aspect to it, part of a network, and that money now is gone. It can be used for political purposes or personal gains, which we'll get onto a little bit in the future. So, to my mind, it seems that there were grounds to investigate whether Nuriyeva is involved in bribery of public officials of Kazakhstan. And it's not just that deal. We have more evidence as well. Many of you will know of the case of neighboring Uzbekistan with Gulnara Karimova, who received $1 billion in bribes from a variety of telecoms companies, most notably the Telia company, a company from Scandinavia. This text, we don't need to go into the details, but this is from our Bad Connection report. This basically shows how the deals in Uzbekistan, which led to a dozen countries investigating Karimova, led to Karimova being indicted, led to hundreds of millions of dollars being frozen. These deals that Telia struck in Uzbekistan are very similar to the ones struck in Kazakhstan. Basically, Telia was buying pretty much worthless companies. Telia was also, and this is new information at the bottom, uncovered by Tom Burgess in his new book, they seem to buy these shares from companies at a vastly inflated price. So a further $80 million went to Nuriyeva's company in another deal, because she was the owner of this company, Almaty Engineering Company. So these deals in Kazakhstan seem almost identical to the ones in Uzbekistan, yet unlike in Uzbekistan, where we've had the United States moving in and indicting Karimova, there's been no investigation, as far as we know, in Kazakhstan, and nobody indicted. Why? Well, because at the time it happened in 2012, Karimova was pretty much on the way out in Uzbekistan. She had fallen out of favor with her father. She no longer held power. But in Kazakhstan in 2012, Massimov was prime minister. There was no way that any Kazakh prosecutor was going to start an investigation against Karim Massimov. But it definitely shows that there are grounds to investigate Nuriyeva for bribery. And the fact that a lot of the Telia deals happened after 2011, when the UK Bribery Act came into force, shows that there perhaps are grounds to investigate anybody with a link to the United Kingdom who might be involved in transacting with Nuriyeva. And I urge the British authorities to look closely at that, because I think there are certainly grounds to investigate. As for Nuriyeva yourself, you might be asking, well, surely she must be, she must have gone into hiding. She might be in Dubai or Singapore. It's going to be hard to track her down. Well, no, as often is the case with this type of person, they've made a home in the United Kingdom, where she has acquired around £12 million worth of property, and more property in Cannes in the south of France. And yet we never seem to see any investigations that are successful into these people, into the United Kingdom, or at least very few. Now, the report then goes on to describe further alleged proxies. So Klebanov, who was the owner of Exim Bank, which was owning the Sherfield company, which was involved in the share deal, he eventually did become the owner of the Kazakh telecom shares after Bodam. And again, we see various suspicious payments around about the same time as that last share deal was happening. We see a separate payment from Sherfield Limited to the Nur Otan party, which is the ruling party de facto led at the time by President Nazarbayev. So it looks like very much that the shares in Kazakh Telecom were passed from one proxy to the next. And if you know your history of Kazakh Telecom, they then, 4 years later, were switched to Kairat Satabaldi, Nazarbayev's nephew. It was almost as if the regime was not even pretending anymore that this company was for the benefit of the Nazarbayev family. And as we know, Satabaldi was jailed in 2022, and his Kazakh Telecom shares were seized and returned to state control, which is almost an acknowledgement by the new authorities in Kazakhstan that, yes, under Nazarbayev, this company was being used as part of a kleptocratic enterprise. Now, once that money is gone, the 25 million, and that 25 million is just one deal that we have, documents for. Deals like this all over Kazakhstan during this period that we know some of, we don't quite have the documentary evidence. Now, Leila was mentioning some of these before. Let's have a look at what, once the money reaches Massimov, what does he spend it on? Two things to note first. We estimate that Massimov, as a state official, should have been earning around $100,000 or $150,000 per year, and by law was not permitted to be involved in any other kind of entrepreneurial work. Also worth noting, as Leila was pointing out, compared to the average Kazakh citizen, the average Kazakh citizen at the time, their monthly salary was around about $650, $700. Yet Massimov spends 10,000 euros on a luxury trip to Paris. The next year, his wife is in Costa Bravo. She's in Italy in 2012. All of these documents are available through the report. She's in Costa Brava again in 2014. Trip cost 39,000 euros. Airfares over $500,000. The particular example on the right is their youngest daughter flying just for 5 days for her birthday back from Boston, where she was studying, to Kazakhstan. Took a $15,000 first-class flight. The payment to the Russian astrologer that Leila alluded to, $200,000. As the dog for the daughter, $3,000. Medical fees, doctors were flown over from America to treat a patient referred to as Mr. X in Kazakhstan. We're not quite sure who it was. It was either Massimov or possibly Nazarbayev. There's a mention on the bill there for geriatric medicine, so perhaps it was the big boss, perhaps it was Nazarbayev, but it looks like Massimov paid. So not cheap flying those American doctors over to Kazakhstan. And the famous Napoleon letters, 97,500 euros. And I think what's fascinating about the Napoleon letters is, as Leila pointed out, in the UK, the high net worth individual, they'll be hiring nannies, they'll be hiring these boutique companies to do all their family business. In a kleptocracy, or at least a kleptocracy under Nazarbayev, it is basically the state officials who are doing that work. And in this case, it was Jean Galiev, a rather senior diplomat. He worked in the embassy in Paris at the time, later became Kazakhstan's ambassador to Paris. It was he who was tasked with picking up Massimov's wife's purchases from Cartier, and in this particular example, sourcing the Napoleon letters, organizing payment for them, and sending them via diplomatic mail to Kazakhstan. And there's other examples of this in the KazaWord data leak. Here's one that Tom Burgess from the Financial Times, or then the Financial Times, wrote about when Massimov was arranging a trip to Euro Disney, Disneyland Paris. His assistant, Talant Muratbayev, wrote to a executive at Kazakhmis, the London-listed company we mentioned before. And the tone is very much that of a travel agent, writing to a travel agent. Samolyot nie malinki, not a small plane. They want a 12-seat private plane to fly the family to Paris. And this is the nature of a kleptocracy. And as Leila says, it is very much reminiscent of an organized crime structure, a pyramid structure where the junior members are funneling money and doing favors for those higher up the chain, in the same way that the consiglieres and the capos will be serving the Don in an organized crime structure. So I think we're coming to the end of my presentation now. What are the solutions? Well, firstly, we have a relatively new sanctions regime, both in the United Kingdom and Global Magnitsky in the United States. And despite Bloody January, despite tremendous evidence of corruption in Kazakhstan, despite the fact that even President Tokayev has talked about wanting to dismantle the system of the super rich in Kazakhstan, the UK, the United States have made a grand total of 0 sanctions against Kazakh kleptocrats, even those of the former regime who are no longer in power. Why is that? Why is that? Why is there that blind spot? You know. And secondly, and I'll end on this, if we really want to be serious about freezing and seizing these kind of assets that are quite clearly the proceeds of crime, but are very hard to prove because, as I said earlier, if the person is in power, that government isn't going to help in their investigation. We're going to have to be a little bit more clever in trying to find ways in freezing those assets. If we designated certain assets as a kleptocratic enterprise in the same way that we say that a asset is terrorist property, then we can more easily freeze it, thereby counteracting the problem that we often have in coming up with evidence which will stand in a court of law in the UK that shows that these assets are the proceeds of crime. Because you're never going to get that. You're never going to get that evidence because they've been, in quotes, legalized by the country in question. That's why in the research that I've done, you very rarely see incumbents who are holding political power losing their property in the United Kingdom. It's only after they've fallen out of favor, lo and behold, the government in question, whether it be Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Russia, whoever, they produce the evidence that allows those assets to be frozen. So we need a new legislation which would allow us to tackle kleptocratic assets here in the UK and in the United States. So I'm going to leave it there. And I'm very interested in listening to your questions, but first I really want to hear from David and what he has to say.
Thank you very much, Tom, for this very precise presentation. And before indeed moving to David, I just would like to remind our audience, please feel free to send us your questions in the chat box or directly to me. After David's presentation, we're going to have a Q&A session. So now, our last speaker is David Zacconi, who is an associate professor of political science at George Washington University. David is also the co-director of Pronouns Eurasia and co-founder of the Anti-Corruption Data Collective. His academic research focuses on corruption, clientelism, and political economy in Russia, Western Europe, and the United States. His most recent book, Politics for Profit, Business, Elections, and Policymaking in Russia, which was published by Cambridge University Press in 2020. His book examines why business people run for political office and how their firms benefit. He also has led numerous investigations into political corruption and opacity in the private equity and real estate industries, published in the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, the Daily Beast, and the Miami Herald, among other outlets. And he received his PhD in political science from Columbia University and his BA from the University of Virginia. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sebastian, for having me, and thank you to Leila and Tom for writing just a stupendous report and investigation covering all facets of corruption related to Massimov. I really want to commend them for producing, in my view, one of the most thoroughly researched reports on both the sources and the consequences or the downstream outcomes related to corruption for a high-ranking official in Central Asia. I understand why Thomas saw this as one of his favorite projects that he's worked on, because it's really just a meticulous, detailed, eye-opening, and really astonishing expose of the way that money moves within the corridors of power, the bribes, the proxies, the enablers, the lavish lifestyle. I mean, this report sadly has it all about how individuals exploit their powerful positions for personal gain, and really are aided and abetted by a supportive cast of characters that are paid off. Some are in Kazakhstan, some are in the West, But there's this attention to detail throughout the report about how it's not just Massimov. It's really just a gang, if you might say. There are a lot of similarities, as Tom mentioned, to kind of different mafia structures, and the way that the enablers and the family members and the business associations created a very complex and sophisticated scheme to remove references to Massimov personally, or kind of keep things off the books, create distance, and stymie investigators that are looking to put all the pieces together. And I think that really attests to the achievements of this report, because it's not as simple, I hate for lack of a better word, as a lot of other investigations where officials put their name on documents. They put their name on real estate records. They sign on the dotted line, even on some of the corporate entities. There's a couple different degrees of removal of distance throughout many of the schemes that are uncovered in the report. And I'm just really impressed by the scope of documentation, and also the work and respect that the authors showed to other people that have uncovered the related schemes. And like, this almost seems in some ways as both an original investigation, but also kind of building on and collaborating with a lot of previous work. And I think that's what makes the findings so striking, is that they're able to triangulate a lot of their own work with things that we already knew or that other journalists had already found, and build this narrative about how much corruption really existed under the Nazarbayev regime. And, this will be part of the historical record. And if there were any illusions about how corrupt the Nazarbayev government was, let them all dissipate. Because I think this will be a marker that academics will use, and scholars and activists and prosecutors will use for many years. So I want to use just a couple minutes I have. I realize we don't have too much time, and I want to open up to the audience, but I want to highlight several of what I see as some of the main takeaways from the report, beyond just the revelations, which I think were really kind of impressively presented. And I want to talk about really what they teach us about how kleptocracy works more broadly, and especially ask some questions about what we learned from the report and how we could use it to improve enforcement efforts going forward. Because, like I said, there's just really clever tactics that come through in the over 2 decades of accusations that are made, and I think they shine the light on different elements of kleptocratic rule that oftentimes don't get center stage, or they're just harder to investigate, and therefore we don't discuss them as openly. So the first one that really struck me is this role of what we might call like in-kind benefits rather than the direct accumulation of resources. I don't want to undermine or kind of downplay the amount of wealth that is like firmly attributable to Massimov and his family. But there's also a lot of companies that stepped up and, as the authors discussed, paid the bills, and kept the expenses on their own accounts rather than directly touching the ledgers of entities affiliated with the former prime minister. And I think that is a really good, in some ways ingenious, but also vulnerable method for engaging in corruption, because there's these cases that are examined in the report, like the French going after Airbus, or the Kazakh mining company being registered in the UK, that they're not just liable to foreign law, but presumably accountants should be asking questions about what these expenditures are being used for, who's benefiting from them, are they connected to politically exposed people? If these companies want to register in the West and take advantage of Western law and arbitration courts to conduct their business, then they also are exposed because the bribes that they're making leave them liable for criminal punishment. And we do see this in the French case. Unfortunately, it seems like the UK authorities haven't caught up to this. But just the idea that a lot of the activity, or a fair amount of the activity that's really discussed here, is happening from companies paying the bills rather than money leaving the accounts of Massimov. And I think that is an exciting avenue, I think, for people really concerned with policy and enforcement, to say, how can we force accounting? Is there a way to force accountants and force these corporations and use existing law in order to kind of entrap or kind of bring justice to the politically exposed people that are using these companies indirectly? I also like this idea of like short sellers playing a role in this. And I wanted to hear a little bit more from the authors about what they would recommend this broader ecosystem of people connected, and how we could use more creative ways to expose this relationship between kind of both domestic and international corporations and politically exposed persons. The second big thing that I took away is that we really need to look beyond the natural resource sector. And there's a nice box in the report that says, look, so much of our attention, especially in countries like Kazakhstan, is paid to oil and gas and then the related companies. But, the developing countries need to build infrastructure across society. And Kazakhstan has grown and developed quite remarkably over the last couple of decades. And that, and for example, in this report, that it increases demand for telecommunications and cell phones and a lot of just day-to-day expenditures and day-to-day kind of necessities for life that politicians can benefit from. And this is so true for the Prime Minister and his family. This is a story about really banal things like licenses and permits. And if the Russian case over the last 2 decades, especially the work of the Anti-Corruption Foundation led by Alexei Navalny, really showed us that public procurement has been this massive fire hose of money from the Russian state. But that's not necessarily the only way that politicians can benefit. And they have a lot of other goodies that they can monetize. And that the state performs so many different functions in society, we can't get lost in just who's getting access to natural resources and who's providing milk to kindergartens at 5 times the price. It's also about the mechanisms and the infrastructure that the state provides where the money can flow. And I really appreciated the way that the report expanded the focus beyond just the typical sectors that we see pop up so often in other countries. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about was just building on what Tom was concluded by. Is I was like, what's the role of sanctions here? And I totally appreciated the attention paid in the report about kind of speculating why Kazakhstan hasn't been hit with the same measures as Russia, and what are the other geopolitical factors that have led to this restraint. But surely the Western authorities have been aware of Massimov for many years, like the border crossings, the hospital visits, the private jets. I mean, I think the report could even go farther and say like it defies logic that we're not that intelligence agencies and financial investigators in the West were just completely oblivious to the fact that this Kazakh official was spending so widely and benefiting from all these different kind of luxury and educational opportunities. So what if we don't want to go far as sanctions because they have all these other consequences, is there a role for other type of tools? I mean, there's not much discussion of like unexplained wealth orders. Talked a lot about, the business associates and how they came out of nowhere. Is this applicable in this case? Are there other tools that are already been, on the books that could help us go after the proxies, which seem to be really critical in this story rather than the officials? And if it is the officials coming over and receiving medical treatment, like questions being asked about who's paying for this, what are the gaps and the loopholes outside of sanctions that could have been used to block some of these transactions or to kind of bring accountability? What changes to existing law could be made on the margins if, as I agree, I understand, sanctions unfortunately are probably off the table. I wouldn't advocate that, but at least in the United States, it doesn't. I can't imagine that our government would do that under the current administration. So, what are there other legal remedies that are available to tackle like the 5 or 6 unique or kind of clever ways that people involved in these schemes have been exploiting? And I want to hear just a little more discussion outside of sanctions. But other than that, I cannot offer more congratulations to the authors because I really think this is a monumental piece of work that will be read for a long time and really kind of helps us understand what happened over these decades under Nazarbayev.
Thank you very much, David. Indeed, this is a very, very impressive report. And before taking the questions from our audience, I think I'm gonna ask Leila and Tom if you want to answer some of David's questions and comments.
Sure. Leila, do you want to go first or should I?
You can go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, thanks, David. Great comments. The sanctions is an interesting one because we hear sometimes, well, we don't sanction our friends, and clearly, yes, when Massimov was prime minister, he is not, neither is his family going to be sanctioned, even though the reason for creating the sanctions regime is in part, to sanction our allies in order to correct, their behavior. And when we're speaking to officials who are involved in sanctions work, we're interested in ongoing corruption that is taken place in the last 5 years. So there seems to be a bit of a disconnect with what they're saying and then what's actually happening, certainly when it comes to Central Asia. But having said that, you could at least sanction them, once they are out of power. And indeed, that was what happened with Gulnara Karimova. Yet for some inexplicable reason, despite lots of evidence of Kazakh corruption related to the old regime, no one has been sanctioned from the Nazarbayev regime. And that just seems a rather strange oversight, even when the current Kazakh government is saying they want to dismantle the economy of the super rich. In terms of the other tools, well, unexplained wealth orders, we don't mention it in this report, but there's a whole other report called Criminality Notwithstanding, where we go into the difficulties of launching unexplained wealth orders. The famous case was against property owned by Dariga Nazarbayeva. And the reason that case failed was because the Kazakh prosecutor said that the assets that Nazarbayeva had used to purchase the properties in the UK, big £130 million block of flats on Baker Street, just where Sherlock Holmes Museum is. The Kazakh prosecutor said that these assets were legal, and unfortunately, the legislation, the unexplained wealth order legislation, says if the conduct is legal under the country in question, then it's legal. We rule it as legal. So the case was dismissed. We cannot, if we're trying to battle kleptocracy, rely on what a kleptocracy says is legal or not legal, because they do not have the rule of law. And when it's the president's daughter, clearly they are not going to say that the assets she has sold are illegal. So it was an interesting attempt at the problem, but failed. And the fact that it did succeed against Tajieva, the wife of the Azerbaijani banker, who is in jail in Azerbaijan, really shows that it can only be effective against people who have fallen out of power. So, as you say, we need new tools. We need to come up with something, and that's why this kleptocratic enterprise idea is, I think, what I'll be pursuing in the next months. But as you say, we do need to have a lot of more focus on the enablers. The enablers often get left behind. Their word that they did everything that they could, that they filed suspicious activity reports, or they just didn't see the corruption, I think quite often is just not plausible. And once you actually look at the evidence, you'll see that questions should have been asked. And if they didn't file a suspicious activity report and they had suspicions of money laundering, then that's a crime and they should be prosecuted for it. Yeah, other things to say, but I won't have the floor.
Leila?
Yeah, well, what can I say? I agree with Tom that relying on what the kleptocracies are presenting as legal is really not is not the best strategy. And that's also what happened, I think, in Dariga Nazarbayev's case, in her unexplained wealth order, where she presented the piece of paper from the Kazakh prosecutors, as Tom again mentioned. In a kleptocracy, what else can a prosecutor say? I mean, that's the president's daughter. He can't just issue a piece of paper and say, yes, well, her money comes from illegal activity of her husband, Rahat Aliyev, and therefore the proceeds are of criminal nature. So that's exactly not how a kleptocracy functions. I think in many ways, the kleptocrats have learned how to use the rule of law systems to their advantage. They know how to manipulate the courts. They know how to how to fight against the law enforcement agencies. They have access to the best lawyers who really have no problem defending them. And obviously, they make tremendous profits off of representing people like that. And they just, as I have mentioned before, they possess incredible financial power that is very difficult to compete. And when you have an agency that lacks resources and whose annual budgets are not even a fraction of whatever these kleptocrats earn in a month, it's really difficult to think of what those law enforcement agencies can do. But again, as we have mentioned, there are success stories. For example, the story of Gulnara Karimova, of how she was investigated by dozens of jurisdictions and her assets were frozen, and now a part of those assets are being returned to Uzbekistan through structures created with the United Nations. So there are stories like that, and I think if there is additional legislation that could help the law enforcement in the UK, in the US, in the EU, actually, EU is a huge question because it doesn't even have a framework for sanctions for corruption. So yeah, it's quite insufficient. To address some of the other questions in the chat, there was a question.
Maybe yeah, I'm gonna ask them, Leila.
That's fine.
Yeah. So indeed, we received several questions. The first one was, so there is a whole sanctions list of corrupt officials and kleptocrats of Kazakhstan submitted to the US State Department and also to the UK Parliament. So question to, you probably, Leila and Tom, do you also plan to write further about people from this list and who could be next in your report?
Yeah, it's a very good question. There is a list that has been submitted to the authorities in the US and the UK. It contains, I believe, close to over 30 people, if I'm not mistaken. We have been submitting some of the people from that list for sanctions to various jurisdictions. Are we planning to write a similar report on any of these people on the list? Probably. We don't know who exactly, but this really is a bottomless pit as far as we see. You can just continue gathering information about any of them, and in many of the cases, these people are connected to the people we have investigated before and to people that have been investigated by the other colleagues. So yeah, there is a huge potential for further reports and investigations and research in that list. We will have to decide on who to pick. It's a very difficult choice. Many of them really are worth looking into.
I think I would add that anyone can Google Dame Margaret Hodge's speech she gave under parliamentary privilege in the UK, where she named 20 or 30 alleged Kazakh kleptocrats, Nazarbayev's daughters, Timur Kudabayev, Alexander Klebanov, Vladimir Kim, Karim Massimov, Aygul Nuriyeva. The information is out there, and it's certainly, I think, as Leila said, all of these figures are worthy of investigation. I'm sure Mr. Kudabayev's lawyers are watching as we speak, but it's up to the UK authorities to take that information that Dame Margaret mentioned in her speech and to take it further, and we'll do our bit of trying to come up with evidence that might support a case.
All right, thank you, Tom. Another question is there some evidence that the Russian money goes through Kazakhstan telecom companies in Europe?
That's not something I've looked at, but what I think is on record is how companies in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan have been used as proxies to evade Russian sanctions. And again, the fact that so few Central Asian entities have been sanctioned or investigated, it would seem to be a rather major blind spot that obviously Russia is going to use its friends that it has, whether it be in official or organized crime, to get money out into the West somehow. And I think it needs to be investigated, because we're having reports of everything from computer equipment through to luxury cars being smuggled to and from Russia via Central Asia.
I wanted also to add that while we were researching this report, we have found additional information, and that actually may serve as an offshoot for the next investigations as well. We have actually found Russian money in Kazakhstan's nuclear sector, a lot of Russian money. So that might be also an area to further look into for the colleagues as well.
All right, so we have a few more minutes, and there are at least two questions related to Tokayev's approach on corruption. So the first one is, what are your views on Tokayev? Is he going to run the same corruption schemes with the help of his family? Also, excuse me, Massimov was denied pardon by Tokayev. Do you see or anticipate any changes in Tokayev's position in future? And the second question is, has there been any serious attempt by the Kazakhstani government to use international legal frameworks, for example, mutual legal assistance treaties, to recover Massimov's linked assets abroad?
Layla, should I go first, or do you want to go first?
Sure.
Well, I think the jury's out on Tokayev whenever you have a new president come in and you have such a seismic event as January 2022. There is always a question, are they really serious about dismantling the system of the super rich, or are they more interested in just getting the people who are against them out of the way, while they, as this question suggests, create their own system? It's perhaps too early to say. There have been some articles on Tokayev family wealth out there, but they don't seem to be anywhere near the scale as the Nazarbayev family. I'd like to hear, I think, from people in Kazakhstan, whether they see the system is changing. I suspect things, if they are changing, change very slowly. And of course, a lot of the Nazarbayev people are still there or thereabouts in positions of power, controlling the same financial flows that they did under Nazarbayev, just perhaps with a different boss. I suspect that the Kazakh government, I know the Kazakh embassy is on the call, is in contact as it should be with the UK authorities in regard to possible asset recovery procedures, as it was, during the Nazarbayev regime when the Ablyazov case kicked off. That was obviously a very high-profile one. We don't see as much noise in the media landscape about it, but I'm sure those links are being made.
Leila, do you want to add anything?
Yeah. What I want to say is it's clear that Tokayev is a veteran of the Kazakh state service. He's been there for decades. He is aware of everything that has been happening while Nazarbayev was in power. So he's not new to the system, obviously. Now the question is a good question, whether or not he's going to establish his own system, or is he going to continue with the existing system? But one thing, I guess, to remember is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So since he is in his position of president, not for a very long time now, I really hope that he will not stay there long enough to turn into Nazarbayev number 2. And I guess our job is to try and to take some preventive measures. And I hope he and his administration will also understand the message that we are trying to put out, and not see us as enemies really, but you know, treat it as a recommendation, as a sort of like a warning, and use it for, you know, for the benefit of Kazakhstan, or for the benefit of the people that he undertook to lead, and not do the same thing that his predecessor did. I think it's also important for the democratic countries to, you know, to react adequately to cases like this, and to start seeing these people, the kleptocrats, realistically, and start understanding what they are. And I don't know how many of the world leaders, when they met with Massimov, I don't know how many of them actually saw him as a kleptocrat. And how many of them actually thought he was just a normal public servant. So that, you know, realistic view of these politicians is I think is very important. And it's quite important also to continue for the for those who have access to Tokayev to you know, to lead these discussions openly with him during meetings at the international level, to just openly discuss the issue of kleptocracy and without any reservations or limitations.
All right, thank you, Leila. We have just two more minutes. And actually, there was a question if there was such if there has been such research on Kyrgyz kleptocrats, and I was also wondering, actually, when we look at the whole Central Asia, if what lessons does the Massimov case hold for neighboring authoritarian regime in the region? Are they treating it like as a warning or simply as a Kazakh specific purge? How do you see that?
Leila, this is one for you. This is one for you.
I think not necessarily. Actually, there was a research done on Kyrgyz kleptocrats, in particular on Maxim Bakiev, and Tom was the author of that report. The report's name is Blood Red Carpet. And I think the second report Tom wrote about Kyrgyzstan, about Maxim Bakiev and Bakiev's regime, called Brave Secrecy, I believe. Two really fantastic reports. I really recommend to read them as well. Now, the question of whether or not we will be looking into Kyrgyzstan in the next months or years, I really hope so. There are certainly very interesting things happening with the new administration of Sadir Japarov and his very close connection with Bakiev, a very personal, close relationship. So I think there will be possibilities for us and Tom to dig into that as well, hopefully.
Tom and David, before we close the event, would you like to add anything?
Nothing from me. Just it's been a great discussion. Big thanks to David for his comments. I know he's not had many questions to answer, but I hope we've not you know, monopolized it too much.
No, I mean, I'm glad the focus has been on you two and your amazing work. So thanks again for having me, and good luck with the next work. I'm excited to see what you produce.
All right, thank you very much. We need to conclude, but I mean, really, what also happens in Kazakhstan, I think, resonates far beyond its borders, and we see global networks of illicit finance who continue to operate across jurisdiction. Sorry, and I believe that the international community really has a responsibility to support transparency, to also to protect whistleblowers, and to hold enablers accountable, whether they are officials in Central Asia or professionals in Western capitals. So Thank you again to our speakers, David, Tom, and Leila, for really your very important work for this very extremely well-researched and impressive report. I really recommend everyone to read it. And thank you to all of you in our audience for participating in this conversation. And we look forward to seeing you again in our Central Asia Program seminar. Thank you very much and have a nice day. Bye.
Thank you.